Institute, climate and environmental education and advocacy nonprofit, headquartered in Florida. I'm in the Tallahassee office. I think that was it.
Okay. And I think Sarah hasn't gone yet.
Hi there. I'm participating via my phone and my video, but I'm Sarah Johnson. I'm based in Western Colorado and have my own gig called Wild Rose Education. And some of the projects that are pertinent to this group is I'm the director of the new Colorado Youth Climate Summit, and I'm in the do all kinds of adult professional development types of courses around climate change in Colorado and beyond. So I'll pass the torch to somebody who hasn't yet shared. Has Patrick gone? I'll give it to Patrick.
Patrick went right after me.
Oh, we already did.
Yeah, but
okay.
Robert hasn't gone yet.
Hi, everybody. Robert Payo. I'm at UCAR with Center for Science Education. And yeah, just glad to be here.
And I think that leaves Gina. Is that right? And Roberta. Gina, you want to go next?
Yeah. Gina Fiorelli-Duranlo. I am the Clean Program Coordinator calling in from Vermont.
And to Roberta. Oh, and Danelle too. Yes.
I think Roberta went, but yeah, I was going to say Danelle, I don't think.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm Danelle Hogan. I'm in Tucson, Arizona. I'm with the Water Center for Systems Thinking, focused on systems thinking.
All righty. And now we'll go to some introductions. Or I'm sorry, some updates, news. What's new with folks? Announcements is the word I was looking for.
I can go. Oh. So yeah, yesterday we opened registration for the kickoff event for the Excel Summit. Just put the link to the registration in the chat there. We are going to be kicking off a new set of working groups. So please come and hear their pitches and think about whether or not you have any interest in joining any of these working groups. They're going to meet for about 6 months in the coming months. And they all have different goals and objectives. Should be like pretty low time commitment, hopefully. We have a few different groups: climate change education for young learners using children's literature, moving youth from knowledge to action, climate career pathways, simulations and games for climate and energy education, climate education equity in action, climate change mental health. So there's a lot going on, and please feel free to join us. The date for that event is January 15th in the afternoon. And do let me know if you have any questions.
And Colleen's got a hand up.
Yeah, I'm hosting a virtual workshop. This is geared towards Alaska teachers, but there's for our KidWin competition that's coming up in the spring. But I just wanted to share that there's a lot of KidWin workshops that are going on virtually and in person. So want to share with your network and folks who are interested in wind solar education. They've got some like specific competition trainings done by like groups like me for regional stuff, but then they also have great workshops like Wind 101 and solar on schools and things like that. So they've got a lot going on, so you can check out their website. And if you happen to know any Alaska teachers, send them my way.
Awesome. Other announcements. I've got one or two. I will. So, oops, that's not where I need to put that. Ingrid and I, but mostly Ingrid, just posted a new blog on considerations for climate change education and the current state of the world. And There is a blurb of good news in there, which I've mentioned a number of times, but it keeps on moving along, and it looks like we are actually going to change climate change education policy for the better in New York State. That's continuing to chug along. The State Board of Regents met with the State Education Department, I think it was last week, to talk about budget and legislative priorities for the next legislative session, and climate change education is in there with an appropriation for $500,000 for next year, that next 25-26 next academic year, for the State Education Department to hire 2 new staffers. And making it into that document means that it is probably going to become official policy, and the appropriations will probably actually pass. So that's exciting news, but still not a done deal. And Alicia has come in, and there's Wendy. So Alicia, do you want to do a quick introduction, and if you've got any announcements, to shout them out while you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. Sorry, I was only half paying attention. So what did you want me to talk about? Then I heard my name.
Just introduce yourself, and if you've got any announcements, to go ahead and announce.
Yeah, my name is Alicia Christensen. I'm with Series, and I support CLEAN and support some of our climate mental health efforts, the pages that we put together, and also kind of support some of the elementary resources and stuff that we have in the collection.
Awesome, thanks. And Wendy, you just popped in. Do you want to introduce yourself and say if you've got any announcements?
Hi, I'm Wendy Johnson, Science Education Specialist with National Center for Science Education. I don't think I have anything new today.
Okay. Any other announcements before we hand it over to Carolyn for today's presentation? Hearing none, I'm going to hand it over to Carolyn to talk about the Educator's Guide to Climate Emotions and Art and Climate Change Education. So go ahead, Carolyn.
Wonderful. Thanks so much again for having me. Again, I'm a little discombobulated because I'm in the middle of the school day, so just forgive me if I'm a little flustered to start, but hopefully I'll get in the vibe and it'll be good. So I've been in conversation with Gina about this presentation. I initially contacted the group to just promote the Educator's Guide, or it's actually called An Educator's Guide to Climate Emotions. There's a lot of overlap between this and the work that I did as part of this committee as part of the Climate Psychology Alliance. And we have a lot of overlap and work closely with Climate Mental Health Network. So I initially contacted Gina. I was like, oh, maybe this group would be interested in this. And I know you've already worked with Climate Mental Health Network. And then Gina also asked me to talk about my art stuff. So I've actually never done a presentation that smushes both. So I'm going to do my best to smush both of them into one presentation, but it's probably more art heavy. There's climate emotions in there, but I also assume that some of you might know the climate emotions piece as well. So I'm going to get going. So teaching climate change through art, and then in the middle, we're going to have a big climate emotions piece. So who am I? This is me on a happy day. I love hiking. So as I said in the beginning, I'm an art teacher. I also am the advisor of our Youth Environmental Society at the school where I teach. I've done that for many, many years. And I'm the co-chair of our district's Climate Action Committee. Outside of school, I work with the Educators Committee of Climate Psychology Alliance. So I sort of am here in both of those capacities. I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm coming from, which I mentioned before, is Lenape-Hoking, which is the land of the Lenape. And it's been very interesting to connect with Lenape folks who are doing really interesting environmental work in New Jersey today. So I would encourage you to look into that. If that's not something you know about where you are, there's a lot of interesting overlap between Indigenous rights and environmental justice and so on, but we'll get into that. So why teach climate change through art? I'm sure there are lots more reasons than 5, but the reasons I'm going to focus on, let me just backtrack for a second. I would assume most of you are coming at this from climate science backgrounds. That's my guess. And I'm an artist and an art teacher, and that's my background, who has worked with students for many years on environmental issues. So, and as a citizen too. So about 5 years ago or so, I think I just felt like I really needed to bring more of the environmental work into my actual teaching art. And in New Jersey, we have climate change standards, learning standards, which went into effect in 2022. And so that was a big push, even before the standards went into effect, for me to just integrate climate change into my art classes. So I'm coming at it from that perspective. I know that most of you are probably coming at it from the opposite perspective, which is that you are probably science folks for the most part, who maybe you're looking to integrate art into what you're doing. So just keep in mind, I'm coming from the opposite end, but I think there's lots of ways that we can meet in the middle. So I know that this is lots of science folks, like this goal is to increase climate literacy. So I think that can be done really effectively through art, and I'll share some examples to nurture biophilia, or a connection to the natural world, both mental, if we're talking about climate literacy, and then the heart, connecting on a kind of physical, emotional level, to express emotions about climate change. So that's going to be the climate emotions piece we're going to talk about in the middle. To develop empathy and justice. So we talk a little bit more about climate justice, and to take action. So yeah, so that's the framework for what I'm going to be talking about. And I just see that there's some comments in the chat. I am really bad at like multitasking. So if anybody wants something from me, just unmute and say, because I can't read the chat while I'm talking.
We can help you we can help you monitor too if something comes
that
up.
would
we
be
can always
great,
interject.
because
yeah,
if I start
I
looking
think
at
it's
the
just
chat,
been
I'll
kind
get
of
completely thrown off.
don't worry about it. Yeah, I think if anything comes up, we can help interrupt you, or if anybody wants to say something to you, they can unmute
Feel
and
free
interrupt.
to
But
unmute.
right now it's just kind of chatter of like, yes, art to communicate
good.
about climate
Okay.
is great, and things like that.
Okay.
So don't worry
Awesome. Okay. So if you'd like to learn more about what I'm going to talk about today, both I'm here to promote the Educator's Guide, but I'm also here to promote a book that's coming out, which is Climate Change Education Across Disciplines. And I have a chapter about using art to teach climate. And this is coming out in February. So, and afterwards I could put links to these or share links with folks if you are interested. So increasing climate literacy. So I'm going to just share some projects. Also, sorry about my like extremely white background. I'm going to share some projects that I've done in the last 5 years. I teach 3 different classes, and my students, I'll just tell you, my students range dramatically in ability levels. So some of the students have significant disabilities. Some of the students are, average art students with or without disabilities. Some are students who are really interested in art. Some are very advanced art students. So it's a kind of wide range of students that I teach. This was a project I wanted to focus on climate change, specifically in New Jersey, and have students use some of the resources that are available about climate change in New Jersey, both from the NJDEP website and through Rutgers, to research about what's happening in New Jersey, and to pick something that personally impacts them. Now, of course, everything personally impacts them, but the goal of this was to like really personalize a climate impact, so it's not something abstract. Even though we've experienced, of course, everybody's experienced climate change, including my students. We've had massive flooding, we've had heat waves, we've had smoke. But again, to really personalize it and for students to have choice, to be able to pick something that's personally impacting them. So this was a ceramics project. I did this in my Ceramics 1 class. And one of the students chose blueberries and the ways that agriculture in New Jersey is being impacted because of the shortening of the cold weather in the winter, and the ways that that's impacting crops like blueberries and cranberries. So that was the research the student did, and then this was a sketch, and then this was the final project that was made. It was a ceramic tile project. As I said, students had a choice. Another student chose impacts to birds. She learned that the American goldfinch is the state bird of New Jersey, and that the goldfinch is being impacted. So that was what she researched. This was her sketch. They had to look up the images, use that to create their sketch, and then this was her finished tile project. So that was kind of my first foray into doing it in a ceramics class. I've since done several others, but I'll show you some of the others that I've done with my ceramics class. Another approach of increasing climate literacy could be done using the warming stripes. I think probably most in this group are familiar with this. And you've probably seen warming stripes from cover of Greta Thunberg's book to magazines to masks and displays in lots of different places. So I had a student in one of my classes who wanted to do a project where she reflected on the impact of climate change on her personally, and the impact of like, how can you take data and personalize it? That was what she was interested in communicating. So she did this project where she took the warming stripes for the United States specifically, and then she replicated those warming stripes in an eye. And this is like quite a large drawing that she did. Painstakingly drawing all of those stripes there. So I'm going quickly through this because I know I don't have for forever. I could talk about this stuff all day. So I'm going to just move on to my next category of nurturing biophilia, or a connection, an embodied connection to nature. So art is a wonderful way to explore the natural world. I take my students outside. You can have students, you can have students collect data. I've had students go outside to collect leaves. They collect data about trees. I've done a tree unit that is based on the school campus the last 2 years. I've done it in 2 different classes. Last year, we did a whole tree inventory of the trees on campus. And then students, I'm going to go into what it turned out to be. But this year, I ended up doing a sort of modified version that wasn't only focused on the trees on campus. It was trees locally. So this was from last year. I had students collect leaves that were on campus, and they identified the leaves. They did research about the trees, and they did observational drawings of the leaves. And then we did the same thing in color. So this was part of a class this is my drawing and painting class. So this was quite a long lesson. It wasn't just how to look at something observationally and draw it, but I also packed a lot of other stuff around it. In addition to, we looked at the stormwater benefits of trees. We looked at the impact of climate change on trees. And I had students do research projects that looked at bigger issues, that are affecting trees such as deforestation and so on. And I'll show you some of those in a second. So because that project took so long last year, and I'm not a science teacher, so it's like I was kind of squeezing this lesson, which just kept expanding in this art class, which was really just supposed to be focused on drawing, painting the leaves. I decided to move it into my ceramics class. So this year, I collected native tree leaves from trees locally, and then we kind of used that. We did go outside. We did a kind of biodiversity, like a modified biodiversity audit, but then the students came inside, used the leaves, and used them to create these trays, which they pressed the leaves into the trays. Around both of these projects, I had students do research and presentations to the class, as I said, about different aspects of trees. So we make the connection to the ghost forests in New Jersey and the impact of seawater on Atlantic white cedars. And so this was from a student presentation about ghost forests. And this was from Maya Lin, who you might know from the Vietnam War Memorial, who designed that. She also did a piece called Ghost Forest. It's an art sculpture piece in New York City where she transferred dead Atlantic white cedars into this memorial in a park in New York City. So we kind of used art as a gateway to looking at that issue. We looked at issues like, why do some places have lots of trees and other places have less trees? And we're in a suburban community. Why does our community have lots of trees and one or two towns over, there's not a lot of trees? And what is the urban heat island effect? So these were presentations that students did to the class. We looked at mental health benefits of forests, like Sharon-yoku or forest breathing. Oops, that was actually one of my students' transitions because these were from student presentations. And we looked at forest defenders like Namonte Nkimo, who's from Ecuador, who's been protecting the rainforest in Ecuador. So these were all sort of ways of taking this small art project and kind of blowing it up and looking at bigger issues. So how am I doing on time? Am I doing terribly or am I okay?
You're fine. It's one.
Okay, good. Okay. All right. So let's talk about a little bit about the emotional issues. I think that we can all agree that, you know, these are just photos of climate change in New Jersey. I think we can all agree that these are images that, you know, evoke a lot of feelings for all of us. I think perhaps you're familiar with the study from 2021, a survey of 10,000 young people across the globe found that young people are very sad, afraid, anxious, angry, and feeling very powerless about what's happening to the climate. And there have been studies, one just came out in the last month or so that was just focused on young people in the US with similar types of findings. When I've talked to my students in class or I've solicited their emotional responses about what we're learning about, it very much jives with the research. So I'm going to actually share some quotes that my students are allowing me to share with you about their experiences. When I've talked to educator groups, one thing I really emphasize is that while we as adults have, you know, climate emotions or feelings about climate change, that the feelings that young people have might be very different because they're looking at a future that, a present and a future that will increasingly be impacted by climate change, regardless of the emission scenario, right? A low emission scenario, they're still going to be facing a world impacted by climate change in ways that, you know, I was born in 71. I don't know that my life has been dramatically impacted for the most part, maybe more recently, but so I think that's important for educators to understand that the emotions that young people bring are colored by that. So this is the Educator's Guide, or I always call it an Educator's Guide to Climate Emotions. And as I mentioned, I've been working with Climate Psychology Alliance of North America, and I'm the chair of the Educators and School Counselors group. So it's a group of, I'm not a clinician, obviously, and other folks who are working in climate education with a focus on climate emotions. There are people who are researchers, college professors. It's mostly college professors. I'm the only K-12 person, and then there's some clinicians. And then we also worked with folks through Climate Mental Health Network. We worked with some of their advisors. We worked with some of their youth advisors and created this Educator's Guide. So we kind of take a perspective of like starting from zero, like maybe you don't really know a lot about climate change, how to teach climate change. What are some ways to dip your toes into teaching it that are mindful of the impact emotionally, mentally, physically, etc., on young people? So our recommendations, this is just a concise summary, are recognize understanding what are some of the common climate emotions that I mentioned. Know that there are disproportionate impacts both for young people, but also for people who are already facing struggles, the ways that those are amplified through climate change. Creating space for climate feelings, we'll talk about that, how you can do that through art and other methods. Letting students know others care, thinking about like the Yale Six America studies. I think that's often surprising to young people to know that how many adults care about these issues because they might not know that, to let them know that we care as educators. Looking at ways to channel emotions into action. Emotions can be really great, sort of has the word emotion, right? So it can move you into action. We talk about the importance of integrating Indigenous perspectives and some of the things that I mentioned earlier about connecting with Indigenous folks who are working on environmental issues, understanding traditional ecological knowledge and other perspectives that Indigenous folks offer. And then ways to care for ourselves and each other. I think this is really big because this is a heavy lift for teachers and to be able to support ourselves and each other. So the Educator's Guide is that and a lot more, and it has lots of resources, including the Clean Network we reference in there. So it is free for download. So what is eco-anxiety? It's defined as the chronic fear of environmental doom. And I think about this painting that one of my students did with this like very heavy sky, right? The sort of burdensome feeling of doom that communicates. There's a lot of different climate emotions. Not all of them are negative. Although certainly we think of the big ones as grief or sadness, anger, powerlessness, frustration. A lot of my students express frustration, fear, sometimes guilt, but there can also be feelings of motivation, feelings of optimism, excitement about the future, about solutions, about what things could look like. So it's a real range of feelings. These are some of the climate emotions that my students have shared with me. This is one student wrote, most of the time, climate change is something that leaves me scared about the future of the planet, as well as my generation and humanity itself. And this was artwork that one of my students did that kind of communicated some of that. It's frustrating to see people in positions of power not doing anything to try and solve the climate crisis. And I'll talk about this painting a little bit later, who it is. And my feelings regarding the climate crisis are a sense of fear paired with a sense of hope, right? So you may have multiple, often clusters of feelings existing at the same time. I think many of you are familiar with the climate emotions wheel. And I'm going to share with you some art-based strategies that I've used to incorporate that. You can also do word clouds. I've done exercises with Post-it notes. People write their climate emotions on Post-its and put them in different places around the room. I'm going to talk about art in a second. Writing prompts, discussion. So there's a lot of different ways to incorporate that. My students love the climate emotions wheel. We got little cards from Sarah Newman, and I gave them out to students. They love them. So this was a project I did with students where it was identify your top 3 climate feelings in circles. So the biggest would be the biggest feeling, second would be second biggest, and third would be the smallest feeling, and color them. And then they shared those with each other. And then some of my students, we have a bulletin board, wanted to make a bulletin board using them. So they cut apart the circles and they created a board that is in the hallway for students to see. This was another exercise that I did. I've not actually done this with students yet. I've done this with teacher groups. And it's similar to the one that I've done with students. So have people identify top 3 to 5 feelings and then think, what color are those feelings? So similar to the other exercise with circles, but this one has what shape are your feelings? And then what size are your feelings? So it's kind of abstract, the concept, but it just kind of let people sit with that, and then they paint the color, shape, and size of their top 3 to 5 climate emotions. And then they use that as a tool for conversation. This is from a workshop I did last week with teachers in New Jersey, and each painting looks completely different. And it's really neat how the painting becomes this gateway for conversation, and people get really excited to explain the painting, even though it might look like blobs. So I've done that a number of times. I'm looking forward to doing that with students. But feel free to test that out and steal that method. This is an artist, Daniela Molnar, who has, she paints about climate change, and she uses loss of glacial ice as she traces shapes of lost glaciers and uses them. And she also creates her own pigments. So we've looked at that with, I've looked at that with students and talked about how can you communicate climate emotions abstractly. I'm going to skip this because I think I'm probably running out of time. So developing empathy and justice. I mean, I've mentioned climate justice a number of times. Folks who are the most vulnerable have also contributed the least. This is something that I bring up whenever I teach about climate change is the concept of climate injustice or climate justice. And this is part of a lesson. I teach a class called world art, and we were studying oceanic art. And so the last couple of years that I've been doing this class, we always talk about what are things that are impacting people in this part of the world today. So we've been talking about the Pacific Island nations and the ways that climate change is impacting them. So students listened to COP26 speeches from Brianna Fruin and Simone Coffey, that famously spoke from the Rising Waters. And then students had to research a Pacific Island nation and present their challenges that they were facing to the group. And they made posters that communicated, and they did a presentation. So that was kind of embedded in an art class where we were making art that was also about the art of that region. So that was sort of like embedded in that. And it was kind of neat. Brianna Fruin saw the post I made about this, and she reposted it. So that was cool for the students to see. This is a climate activist. She's an American climate activist, Daphne Frias, this disabled woman who's grown up in an environmental justice neighborhood where she's been impacted by pollution. It's impacted her health significantly. And so art can be a way for students to explore other people's experiences, whether they're like or dislike their own. And so this was a portrait that a student of mine had made. In the upper left, that was a portrait of a climate activist from the Congo. His name is Guillaume Kalonji, and that was the portrait. One of my students chose him. They had to, it's called a climate hero portrait. So students had to research a climate hero, and this particular student researched Guillaume. And then we actually met with him over Zoom and heard his story about his activism. This is another portrait. This is Anna Pelletier, who's a young Indigenous activist from Canada. This particular portrait has a really interesting story. We shared the portrait of Nyombi Morris on social media and connected with Nyombi, who's from Uganda. And he ended up, he was in New York last year, and he ended up coming to our school, and the student was able to give him the portrait that she made of him. And he did talks for all of our students, and he visited the elementary schools. And so art was an amazing gateway for that experience. And I think it's really important, obviously, to share solutions with students. A lot of times they don't really know about solutions, or maybe they do know quite a bit. Project Drawdown, of course, is a great resource. And I had this idea of like, oh, I want to do something where it's like art piece about each climate solution. And I don't know, I decided to kind of go with that. I'm going to jump ahead a few. And so we looked at other artists that do stuff about climate solutions. So these are these ceramic boxes, and students had to research using Project Drawdown, research climate solutions, and then make these solutions boxes. And then we stacked them on poles, and they're outside in our school courtyard. They're actually inside now for the winter. They're in a different indoor courtyard, but looking at solutions like obviously solar, wind, green transportation, protecting forests, protecting marine life, and so on. So, and then the art pieces we actually planted at the bottom, and it was kind of part of the garden. And then there was also explanations of what the project is that the students did. So I hope that I left questions.
15 minutes left. That was great.
Yes, good. I'm such a talker that sometimes I just like blah, 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 blah. So anyway, okay, questions. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, it was great. So questions, anyone?
Just awesome,
Go ahead.
amazing work. I love hearing about it from a teacher, especially. And I think this is rhetorical, but my main question is, how do you find the time to incorporate
Oh,
all of this and do all of this on top of your teaching? No, I just
well,
wanted to say
I mean,
it's amazing. Thank you for sharing all of what you do.
you're welcome. I think like, when I've worked with other teachers, the thing that I always say is like, find something you're already doing and just like, because the portrait project, the students were already doing portraits. And like so it was just like do a climate hero portrait. So that was the tweak. Currently, my students, I was hoping I would have some finished ones, but I've been doing this drawing project for years and years and years where students learn how to draw their hands. It's quite a hard project, how to draw it realistically. And for years, I've just had them just draw hands. And then I had them draw hands interacting or hands holding something. And then this year I was like, I'm gonna have them research they had a choice of 4, so it's either plastic pollution, climate change, climate solutions, climate justice. So those were the communicating about one of those issues. So it's still the hand drawing, but it has this like added twist in that it's addressing climate standards or it's addressing climate in some capacity. Colleen?
Thank you. Great presentation. I appreciate how you're able to bring in the emotions and the art into both of it. Obviously very related. And you sort of started answering my question. So I work for a nonprofit, and so I do a lot of like support for teachers however I can. And so kind of my question is like, what could someone like an informal educator support organization do to help art teachers or others incorporate it? And so, I mean, you kind of the first thing is like, communicate to them, what are you already doing, and just add a twist to it or add to it. And so I don't know if you have other things to add to that.
Yeah. I mean, I've done workshops with our teachers, and I just say like, what are you doing where you can add climate as an add-on, right? But then sometimes there's, if you're looking at like the climate emotions piece, like the really simple, like draw 3 different climate feelings, like, shapes, colors, sizes, like that. I've not done that with students, but it seems very accessible for adults anyway. The one that I have done, like I said, with students is just using circles. So that's like a super easy integration of the emotions, climate emotions through art piece. Can you ask your question again?
So what could folks like me who are, informal educator working for a nonprofit who do teacher support, what are ways that we could support art teachers or others in incorporating art?
Right. I mean, sometimes just sharing like existing lessons and showing examples, I think can sometimes be like a light will go on for someone and be like, oh, now I can visualize that. Of course, Subject to Climate has tons of great lessons. The Climate Hero lesson that I shared, that's in I wrote that for Subject to Climate, so that's there. But I think just like looking at what other folks are doing around these issues. And if you can't find examples of lessons, sometimes sharing like artists who are doing art about these issues. I shared like 1 or 2, but sometimes that can spark ideas too. Other questions?
I was just going to say the climate chapter of the National Climate Assessment, the 5th National Climate Assessment, is really great. And there's accompanying podcast, and one of the episodes of the podcast is on art and climate. That's a really interesting listen.
Yeah, that I didn't mention this, but there were several of the art pieces that I shared that 2. there was one I didn't share in this presentation, but I had students' artwork that was in the National Climate Assessment. And that was, I mean, that process was so incredible for students to like work and make something and then see it kind of take on a life of its own. I think a lot of times students, like especially in art classes, it's like you're making stuff in the class, and even if you have a display, even when you have an art show, I think a lot of times students don't connect with like, oh, this is communicating to people. And seeing their art in that National Climate Assessment was like very, very powerful. Just like, let's see if I could go back to the beginning. The first, this one here. This is one of the pieces that's in the National Climate Assessment. And there were a few more as well, but I loved that, you know, people are thinking about ways of incorporating art because art impacts emotion, right? And so some people look at a graph or a chart and don't really get a lot from it. I mean, I do, but some people don't. And I think art can reach a lot of people in ways that data doesn't always. Carolyn, nice name.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the Javier Cortada Foundation?
I know who he is, but I am not familiar with what the foundation does.
Oh, I mean, it's, you know, mainly just like supporting his work, but he does a lot down in South Florida. Cleo's done some work with him and at his events that's explicitly around like raising awareness and raising money for climate action. So I don't know if that was something you'd be interested in to like share with your students, but of course you already know about it.
Yeah, well, yeah, he's actually in the National Climate Assessment too, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, very cool artist and love his work. Yeah, thank you. Colleen, is that another question or that was from before?
Another comment, yeah. I put it in the chat, but I also just wanted to flag it for you. KidWin, which is a national nonprofit that does wind and solar competitions, they have their National Wind Energy Art competition that's going on right now. So another one to share from KidWind for folks.
Interesting. I think that my niece maybe is involved in KidWind. I have to look into that because that sounds very familiar to me. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. I actually have a student who, for the hands drawing project, she did hands putting windmills into the ground. And that might be a good match there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Robert.
I'm sorry, I
Oh,
can't
sorry.
remember what grades you teach, but this one's for
High
K
school
student. Okay, yeah. So these ones are
Oh.
K-8. So, but yeah.
Well, I could share it with
Yeah.
other art teachers. Thank you.
Yeah.
Robert.
Thanks, lovely presentation.
Thanks.
You know, it's nice that New Jersey has those standards, but I mean, was there pushback in your school and district, or what do you tell people that bring that up for their situation?
I mean, yeah, I mean, when I first started integrating climate into my art lessons, I was definitely wondering if I was going to get phone calls or complaints, but I did know that, you know, I have the excuse of it's very explicit in the standards. So it's in our curricula, it's in our, like I've rewritten the curricula to include it now. So it's a good question because I know that, you know, it's not just with art, it's across the board with teaching climate. And I'm remembering a New York Times article that was about it was last year, about teachers in Florida who are teaching climate change, you know, and the issues that they're dealing with trying to teach climate change in a state that, doesn't really want to acknowledge that that's happening. I'm not sure what to say because this is the only context that I've worked in is in New Jersey, where I'm in a supportive district, in a supportive state. I don't know. I'm gonna think about that. That's a really good question, because I do sometimes, present to groups that are not local, and that is a really good question. Do other people have ideas?
I think you would find a lot of ideas in this group. And folks on the outside and on the inside of that question. And while I wanted to jump into that, I was curious. I can't raise my Zoom hand as host, but I was curious. I've done a lot of work in this space, and I was curious what you've done to connect students' art with community action, because that always seems to be kind of a challenge point in this space.
Yeah.
I wanted to throw that in before we continue talking about district challenges.
Yeah. That's a really good question as well. And I don't think, do you mean local community action? Yeah. I don't think that that's something I've explored. No, that's not true. I was like, that's not something I've done a lot of. That's not true. This isn't climate per se, but New Jersey, there's a connection if you follow the plastic connection back to the petrochemical industries. So there's a connection this way, but New Jersey has a plastic bag ban that went into effect a few years ago. And I worked with students to create informational / educational, inspirational posters that were then displayed in local businesses. So I think that was like maybe an attempt, but actually we're looking right now at so it's interesting because with the students that I work with, we're doing a lot of engagement in climate action, both in the school district and locally. They're engaged in a lot of different efforts, and I've not integrated art into that yet. But I am, except for the plastic bag ban thing, but I do think there's a project that we're looking at doing that might involve green infrastructure, that would have an art component, but it's still in the early stages. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential for that. New Jersey has artists who have been professional artists, not student artists, who've been working to create projects that engage climate action. Those are really interesting projects to look at and share with students. Great question. Yeah. Was there another question? Did you have a second question or comment, Patrick?
No, I just interrupted your question on districts navigating challenging spaces. I think that's something we've talked quite a bit about as a group. We have a page on teaching in controversial spaces on clean. And there are folks that are working with that challenge every day, like Carolyn in Florida and others from challenging places to be. So I think there's a lot of different answers to that question.
I will just say, as an art teacher, that I was like very nervous to start teaching climate explicitly in my lessons, and I did have pushback from students who were annoyed because they were like, this is art class, can't we just like make art stuff that's like not about anything? And then I'd have to be like, well, actually artists make stuff about things happening in the world. So it's like, I think sometimes students would just want to come in and make art that's like cartoony or silly or like, and so the pushback I actually got was more from students. But I was very worried because I was like, this is like outside of my area. Like, I don't want like my science colleagues to come after me and be like, you're teaching my stuff. Like, so, but I don't think I do teach their stuff. I think I like take their content and then go with it in an art direction. So, but I do think that art teachers can be sort of vulnerable because of that to outside challenges. Like, I think some people, you know, it's sort of like, it's not the same, but like when people say, you know, stay in your lane. So.
Yeah, the world is a very interdisciplinary place.
It is, but
yeah,
but
we are-
sometimes people don't like that.
that is very true. That is very true.